Welcome to No Sex, Please, I'm Religious. For 2,000 years and more, religion has had its own way with sex. The greatest battle it has ever faced is how to control the masses who love it. And so began the story of shame and disgust and dishonour. Forget he who must be named, but never forget it that must always be kept undercover. Welcome to an episode of No Sex, Please, I'm Religious, where a team of brilliant, quirky, and sometimes irreverent believers explore and challenge the illicit relationship of religion and sex. Such poor bedfellows.
Oh dear. Today I'm publishing another episode in the podcast, an interview with a wicked man, totally wicked. And I'll tell you who it is in a moment. You'll know anyway because the name will be on the title of the podcast. I'm really struggling to understand the importance of empathy in the journey of human beings today. I believe in empathy. I believe in compassion, caring for others, some of the great Christian and humanist views on life. Things like doing unto others as you'd have them do unto you, loving your neighbour, those sort of things. But I don't see it. In so many areas, I don't see it. We've been trying for some time to raise funds to help queer refugees in Africa. These are people. These are human beings. They're not wicked people. They are not perverts or anything like that. They're just people. They could be your sons and your daughters. They could be your brothers, your sisters. They could be your friends in your school. But people don't seem to want to respond. So now I've started a shop as well. We're going to sell some products in there and hopefully raise some money that way. And I'm hoping that people will support this podcast with a cup of coffee, the amount of a cup of coffee or something like that through Patreon, or regular gifts, $5, $10, $20 a month. Refugees in Kenya, the queer refugees, struggled through the last election. Now, the reason for that was because the new president of Kenya is a man who is totally homophobic. This article comes from Open Democracy, and I'll put the link in the notes below. The title of the article was "What Lies Behind Kenyan President-elect William Ruto's Homophobia." He goes into a lot of stuff there. He's linked to groups that have attacked the LGBTIQ community, and when those attacks occur, the police do not look into it properly. The people are not brought to justice. If queer people are arrested and brought before the courts, they will be charged and go to jail for 5 years or longer. It's a pretty horrendous situation. Now, when in 2015, Ruto was speaking in a church, and he told the congregation in Nairobi that the Republic of Kenya is a republic that worships God. There is no room for homosexuality in Kenya. If that is the case, then the God that he is talking about is not the God that I understand and believed in from the Bible. Not the Old Testament God was pretty vicious at times, pretty cruel. But then somehow he changed and he became merciful. And Jesus taught things like loving your neighbor. And there's that great story about the neighbor being someone, a Samaritan who's meant to be an enemy, someone you wouldn't cross the road to meet or you wouldn't do anything to. And this fellow rescues the Samaritan. I mean, there's all this stuff out there that's so real in the teachings that show mercy and love in action and kindness. It doesn't talk about attacking queer people. Then you look at somebody like John MacArthur, who was a leading TV evangelist, mega church pastor, highly regarded by Christianity today as a preacher of expository preaching and so on. And his comments about queer people and gay people are just plain wicked. Writer on Medium, John Poletti, who is not a lover of Christianity anymore, I don't think. He came out of the Evangelical Church. He's got a huge number of followers. He writes an article, "A child rape scandal at John MacArthur's church has evangelicals brawling." It's worth reading, and I'll put a link to that one as well. But again, in the article there, talks about the pedophile pastor who was protected in McCarthy's church. Perfectly protected in John MacArthur's church. And there are other pedophiles that he talks about as well. So it's okay for MacArthur to be persecuting gay people, just as long as he's true to his real beliefs, which is protecting the pedophile pastor, the man of God, and victimizing the victim, abusing the victim. So now let me come back to the fellow I wanted to talk to today, and I would love you to listen. He is a friend of our podcast. He is Ross Murray, a deacon in the Lutheran Church of America, and he's going to tell you more about himself. But the thing that is most wicked about this Christian man...
All right, now today we have a wonderful guest, Reverend Ross Murray. I was going to call him Reverend, and he now tells me that he's irreverent. No, hang on, I got that wrong. He's not irreverent at all. But
very irreverent, that's true.
Are you? Oh, that's fantastic. Good. I'm a bit irreverent as well. I can be irreverent quite often. No sex, please. I'm religious. We're so grateful to have you as a guest. And Ross, introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I am Deacon Ross Murray. I am a deacon in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And that means that I live at the margins of where we call it where the church meets the world. A lot of deacons' work is external facing, doing work in the world, representing the church, bringing that mission out into the world, and also often representing the reality of the world to the church that lives. And I do that through my day job, which is as the vice president for the GLAAD Media Institute. And GLAAD is an LGBTQI advocacy organization that works primarily with the media and the representation of LGBTIQ people in the media, because we know that impacts what people know about us, how they think about us, how they feel about us. And then on the side, I have other projects, things like the Naming Project, which is an LGBTQI church camp for teenagers. If you've ever been to like a Bible camp, imagine one that's super queer. We run that for a week out of the summer for teenagers, and also host my own podcast. Don't host, I produce. Other people host a podcast called Yes Jesus, which is a irreverent comedy podcast about queer Christianity that is hosted by the actor Daniel Francesi and the former television. And I get to do the research and write scripts and sometimes write those irreverent jokes that I probably shouldn't say myself professionally, but I can make somebody else say. So young youth ministry is a bit of my background, media, how the narrative gets told, what creates identity development, are all parts of what kind of build into what I work in.
Oh, that's absolutely fantastic, Ross. You've got an amazing career happening there.
I've got a lot going on, and I am busy and tired all the time.
Yeah. You've just come back from visiting Australia. We didn't get to catch up here, but you're in New York, and only a couple of days later, you're talking to me.
Yes. Yeah, I may be getting back on this time zone. I had 2 nights ago, had about half a night's sleep, and then last night slept very hard until the alarm went off and was in the middle of a dream that was some kind of combination of Stranger Things, the US Senate, and camping, and also wearing underwear that got really wet because I fell in a river. That's what I remember about the dream and how it came together, and then the alarm went off.
Oh dear. Now, as this podcast is exploring the relationship of religion, not just Christian, but others as well, to the 4-letter sex word. And I has to say 4-letter because, sorry. Now, what we're looking at is a long history, and it starts with St. Augustine, really, and probably goes back further. But we're starting with St. Augustine and his attitude to sex. And he's considered one of the great fathers of the church. So what we've had is all kinds of things happening.
So he was an Augustinian. Yeah, he was an Augustinian, but then, so this is one of those like Lutheran like legends that I don't know if it's actually true or not, but it gets told that he, as part of the advocacy, was also a priest to be married. Priests didn't have to be celibate, and clergy members and these nuns. And so these nuns snuck out of a convent, apparently in a herring barrel, and a bunch came to him and said, "We're free now, what do we do?" And he was like, "I don't know what to do with all of you." And so he was finding kind of husbands for all of them and paired them up, presumably with other priests, former priests, and letting them get married. And Katie Luther, Catherine von Bora, was like the last one. And he was actually trying to find a different spouse for her, like not me. But she made the case that like, no, we should be a partner and this is how it will work. And you can do this part and I'll do this part and this is how we'll work together. And then where this gets connected to your podcast is the rumor is on their wedding night that their lovemaking was so violent that it broke the ropes that were holding the bed together. He had held it pent up for many years and let it loose all at once and broke the bed. I cannot claim whether that's true, but that's what I've heard.
But that was actually haven't read that story. I'd only seen things that he'd said. But look, I won't go there at the moment. I'm really interested, Ross, on your take on the approach that religion in your studies has had to the issue of sex. And obviously, your focus is very much on LGBTIQ. My view is that as you go back further, it's on heterosexual couples and all the rest of it. The church has always wanted to be in our bedrooms, and so have the mosque, and so has the temple, and so on. So what's your take on that?
So I think there's a few things that are happening here, and that we've got different strands, and it's what strands ends up being in power and taking power.
Yep.
There are definitely movements within all religions, and I know Christianity more than others, but that have been very pro-sex, that have read a lot more into the teachings of Jesus, the stories of Jesus, retelling that story of Jesus and the beloved disciple who's reclining on his breast, and then these desert movements like venerating the breast of Christ. And so putting this very homoerotic spin. And if you've seen any of the old paintings that have depicted the beloved disciple and Jesus, then they've got him holding a scroll in a very strategic part of his body, and then the other guy's head is on his lap. So you have this very right. That's existed for a long time. And then we had this like Augustinian approach that really did, and this heresy that we've always fought of what's the difference between our bodies and our spirits. And like our spirits are pure and holy and of God, and our bodies are really gross and messy and discharge things and get dirty. And so those things tend to that there's this tension that exists. The other thing I think that happens with Christianity is you have the establishment of patriarchy, of white supremacy, and of colonialism. And that takes that purity culture, it takes that sort of Augustinian, who was from Africa as well, we just got to say this too, was an African, and then turn that into, we are going to reinforce European cultural norms. So the center of the church has now moved from North Africa and the Middle East, centering itself in Europe. And part of their evangelism is let's make the rest of the world be like Europe. And so we're going to exploit, and we're going to use those. And we put a veneer of religion that goes on top of that, but it also is very handy at keeping people in order and in line and establishing a hierarchy so that you have white men, straight white men, being at the top of this pyramid, and other people getting some levels of power by their proximity to the patriarchy and the whiteness, and be able to use that and trying to keep folks in line and in order. And so we see that progression happen over and over time again. And I think we're now at a really interesting moment in history where the church has lost a lot of its power and its authority, both real political, legal power and authority, but even the cultural authority. And so what's odd is that it could have something to contribute so positively into the world, but because of the harm that it's caused, people are just saying, we're going to establish our own ethics, our own sexual ethics. And maybe they're doing that in combination with their beliefs, but also they live in the real world. So there's my summary of 2,000 years of Christian history and sex.
Fantastic. Thank you. The weird thing, of course, is that, and you look at abuse within the church, and it's been across all churches, although I think that the Catholic churches have done worse out of this.
I don't know. There's some reports coming out of the Southern Baptist movement in the United States that is probably not as long running, since Southern Baptists aren't as old as the Catholics, but it's also very bad.
Okay, yeah, and of course cults as well. And cults. So it seems to me wherever there's a fundamentalism that has to exercise a coercive control over people, you repress people, and eventually bad things. You can't really stop that.
And power is corrupting. So we see that show up in cult attitudes where you've got people that are maintaining their position of power within that particular cult, but then we also see that happening out in wider, more mainstream world as well. And we get elected as leaders and religious leaders, and we think about, I want to be a servant leader, I want to be helping. It's very easy to want to stay in the trappings of comfort, or of people respecting you, or having the authority to do something, and we don't necessarily want to lose anything. And so we don't want to give up. I'll say this, as a white guy, I don't want to give up my privilege. I don't want to give up my male privilege, that I've been used to it and I'm accustomed to it. And by losing it, it feels like a loss, even though I can also imagine me actually living in harmony with other people would be much better for me. But we still have this very irrational emotional attachment to it that doesn't want to let it go. And I think that's where some of that hypocrisy comes up, is these are the rules that I have to establish and push onto everybody else. But I also want to use my privilege in order to do the things that I'm not letting other people do. And that can be have sex, have affairs, have abortions. But I also am going to pass rules to make sure that none of you get to do that too.
Yeah, and look, I fully understand that. My background, you may not know it. I spent about 16 years in a cult with a woman who thought that she was God. And the best thing she ever did was die. And then I ended up being in charge and tried to dismantle the hierarchy. But I certainly understand, and then to dismantle the whole thing eventually. And yes, I do understand that. I understand the person in power has all kinds of access to that they're forbidding the followers to have. And you see it in China. You see it in all totalitarian regimes.
And I think the other thing that we also need to remember, since we've talked so much about Augustine and Luther, the other thing that happens for people that are in power, and it's not even power necessarily, we are all working through our own stuff. And I am convinced that Augustine and Luther, and we can add other people to this too, but I know them better than others, are always working through their own stuff.
Of course.
They had a terrible, bad experience, Augustine talks about being a wild child and enjoying the fruits of life and pleasure. If you do that without moderation or without care, it does end up harming you. And I have a hunch he got harmed and then had to reprocess that. And what he did was he reprocessed that out loud in front of the world. I don't know if he knew at the time, but through his confessions and saying, now, this is how we're going to have stuff. And what we've done is taken those writings and say, good, these are rules for everybody else, right? Luther had that same thing too. So much of his theology is frankly built on his own hang-ups about his life, about his salvation, about his very goodness. So he has to work this out to feel like he's in a good place for himself. Of course, followers say, that's a good idea, we should do that. And then as we institutionalize it, it turns into hard and fast rules, realizing that he's trying to answer particular questions for himself. Augustine's trying to answer particular questions for himself. And we are too. We are living creatures in relationship with one another. We are sexual beings. We have desires. We do dumb things that sometimes hurt ourselves or sometimes hurt other people. And we have to somehow figure out how to deal with the ramifications, the consequences of that. And what I don't want is for people to have my own self-care turned into an institution and rules for everybody else to have to follow.
Absolutely, yeah. Tell me about, because you work with young people a lot, okay, and a lot of them are queer folk, and what we're doing here is trying to raise funds for queer people who, it's life and death struggles they have in Africa. And the hatred and the violence and the oppression that they face is real. There's no nonsense about it, it's real. And been too many deaths even in the last couple of years that I've been involved in this. But tell me about the young people that you're working with, and you wrote a great book for them, really, didn't you? What's the name of the book again?
The book is called Made, Known, Loved, Developing LGBT Inclusive Youth Ministry.
Wonderful.
And the idea there is, actually, the book is less for the young people, and it's more for the adults that are working with young people on to be good adult leader, guides, ministers, mentors, how to minister to young people, young queer people, in a world where they are still figuring out who they are. So one of the things I'm really big into is identity development. And who am I? Who did God made me to be? And then the other part of that question is vocational. What do I do in the world? And I think adolescence is that time where people work to figure out who they are. They figure out what their relationship is with the rest of the world. Remember, a lot of religions have a rite of passage that sort of exists during those teenage years, where you go from being your parents' child, they dress you, they control you, your faith is their faith just because you were born into that. And then at some point, you do something that sort of takes it on yourself, right? The confirmation, or for some believer, baptism, bar and bat mitzvahs, right? All of these things happen at a certain age that is okay, it's not just me being handed all this stuff as a child, but I'm going to actually live into this for myself. And I think knowing and understanding that at a young age can be helpful, so you don't have to do this undoing and this processing later. And one of the gifts of people being able to come out younger, at least younger than I did, is that then they can go through adolescence once, and they don't have to do this second adolescence now as a newly out queer person experiencing the world, but they can do it as a young person. And I think one of the things that's come up with sex and sexuality, and this has been a very United States thing, I don't think you've seen this as much in Australia yet, but there's been a renewed charge that anything that is LGBTQI related is instantly sexual. And the conflation of who I am, a part of a descriptor of who I am, is inherently a sex act. Sexualizing young people by acknowledging that queer people exist, or by having a drag queen read a children's book in a library and promoting literacy, or running a camp like ours, we get these sort of accusations because people don't, I realize, like, we can talk about sex and sexuality, and that's really important to make sure that people are safe and people are healthy, and we will have conversations to make sure they're not going to make choices that end up harming themselves, and we're going to do that in a very real way. But primarily for the naming project, for the LGBTQ ministry program that I do in the camp, it is really make sure you know who you are, make sure you know your values, what's important to you, because the decisions about what you do, especially in relationships and sex and sexuality, when you deviate from who your real essence is. And you can tell that you've made bad choices because you're feeling pressured into doing something or to acting a certain way. And trying to make that decision in the moment is what's really hard. And so having conversations up front about who am I, how do I relate to God, how do I relate to the rest of the world, in a sex sort of aspect, you know, what's important to me, what do I want to maintain? What do I like? And what are some things that I absolutely don't want to do? And setting those really hard, firm boundaries for yourself. And if you're going to change them, you do that yourself, by yourself, on your own, not because someone else is saying that you should have sex, or even that you shouldn't have sex for a particular reason. I want people to make choices about their life and their relationships and their sex and their sexuality because they've come to a very informed, faithful self-discernment, knowing who they are. And then they can think about how they build relationships, friendships, romantic relationships with other people.
See, what you're doing there is you're illustrating the point that I think is so important. A lot of times, and it leads into the question, sex education, which should primarily come from parents. And so what you're saying is not just relevant only for LGBTIQ youth, it's for all youth. Everybody helping our young people to understand that be true to yourself, understand who you are, understand where you are in your world, how you see yourself and what you want to do and so on. Let me ask a question out of that, and only answer if you're comfortable with it. When I think back to the sex education I had, it was, in my case, because I'm a lot older than you, in my case, I had nothing from my father. I had nothing from my mother. I found a book that my father must have had for my older brother, who's 10 years older than me, in his drawer. How many young boys have done that? And the other thing is, it came from other friends. And in one case, I had a friend whose father was a doctor, and the doctor, he must have been much more frank with his sons. He was a doctor. If I had questions about all kinds of things, I'd ask my mate, and I think I got reasonable answers. But in my view, it's because we're so afraid to talk about it. And I think this does directly relate to religion. Even if people are churchgoers or they're not practicing Muslims or whatever, it's how the religion has impacted culture. Okay, question. Are you comfortable to tell me about how you learnt about sex, Ross? Now, you don't have to go there exactly.
So I have shared this story with people before.
Have you?
And
Okay.
There was sex education in my school, although my sister summed up sex ed for my parents too. And they said, so we went and we learned about the girls and periods, and the boys learned about girls and periods, but never ever talked about what the boys did. And that was probably true. But this is what my parents did. I did not know what I was getting into, but my parents popped a movie into the VCR, and we watched 16 Candles. And that was the introduction to having the sex talk, which they initiated right after the movie ended. And to this day, I do not know why they decided that 16 Candles was like the entry point into learning about sex and sexuality. But after that, they just sat me down. This is how it works. And they talked about it. And I will say, I was young when my mom was like, the penis gets hard and it goes into the vagina. And I talk about this. And then I said, so when you're done and it comes out, does it like make a noise? And I was like,
I love it.
and I was like, so yes, maybe I will ask about this at some point, because I will say they did better talking about it and explaining it to me than I think what I've heard most other people get, especially from their parents.
Okay.
Maybe the movie I assume this was planned the way my mom went into this right when it was over. I don't know, maybe it was spontaneous, but I know sometimes we would watch media, and if there was a theme that they picked up on they would have a little talk to us about whatever the theme was of the show or whatnot. And if this was pre-planned, or if they just needed an icebreaker of something like the movie to make it feel like, to break the ice for them too, so it made it worthwhile to talk to. Because I talk like I can be this free, but I have the same like discomfort and hang-ups and don't want to approach. I do tell a story in my book about, I was gathering from something that one of my campers was saying, that he was also struggling, and I wanted to figure out how to talk to him, but also didn't want to be the creepy older person that is talking to a young person. We at the Naming Project, we break up into small groups, and we actually break up into gendered groups and give youth some different options to choose from. And I'm with the boys, the guys, and right as we're about to break up, this kid says, "Can I ask you all a question?" And we all said, "Sure." And then he said, "Sometimes I'm sitting alone in my room and I just feel really frustrated, like really frustrated. I need to figure out something that I can do with that energy." And there's two adults helping to facilitate this. Before we can say anything, the other youth jump in. "It sounds like you need a hobby. Maybe you should do something like take up the guitar, and then you've got something to do with your hands." And he says, "That's great advice. Thanks." And then the lunch bell rings, so we have to like leave, and the kids all leave, and the other leader and I are stuck behind, and we give each other this look. And I said, "Do you think that he met?" And the other guy interrupted, "Oh yeah, absolutely. Someone needs to talk to him." And so I was like, all right, fine. So like later that afternoon, I pull this kid aside, and again, very aware, I need to approach this very carefully. And I was like, "You asked a question. Did you get the answers you were looking for?" And he's like, "Yeah, I thought that was great." "Okay, because sometimes when people say frustrated, that means something else." And he was like, What does that mean?" So then now it's up to me to be like, "Well, sometimes when they say frustrated, they mean masturbation." And he said, "Yeah, it wasn't that." And of course, then I'm mortified and my face is all red. And, "Okay, well, thank you for having this conversation. We're done now." I'm walking away, because I'm like, I don't want to be I don't want to be the creepy guy that's doing that. But also, I just stigmatized it by the way we set this up and made it this secret, like whispered conversation, and doing the same thing that I wish we didn't do. But it's very instilled in us.
Yeah, it sure is.
And, I showed him 16 Candles.
Was that awkward for you, watching 16 Candles with your parents when you were young, or not?
No, I think, and even to this day, I probably watched a lot of things that I didn't really fully understand, and I don't think I thought of that. I still don't think that movie is sex education. And so I don't know if I necessarily got the connect of what we just watched and why we're having this talk right now. And it's funny now, as a grown-up adult who's out and living in the world, I probably have more embarrassment when my parents do talk about sex stuff. And my parents will make sex jokes, and they'll say stuff in front of me too. And I was probably more open when I was younger, but I don't know why. When I'm a grown-up teenager, I'm, "Oh, no, you don't have to."
Don't want to go there.
Yeah, maybe let's not go to the Pride Festival because I don't know who you're going to see or what you're going to see. Like, I just like that. And I realize my parents are like, they are much looser and freer and much more open-minded than I'm probably giving them credit for. And I have to go back to remembering like that, me being a kid and them like being very honest and blunt and talking about things and giving me information. But now, I don't know, as an adult, now I have the uptightness about my parents specifically.
Yeah, I get it. I get it. My adult kids are probably not very comfortable about me doing this podcast because, unfortunately, not only did I not get the sex talk, my kids didn't get the sex talk either. And the thing about it, too, is that because there are so many hang-ups that are passed down from one generation to the other, your parents were pretty good to do what they did with you, but it really should be a subject that you can talk about freely. I just listened to an audio book. I'm just trying to get the name of it for you. This was by a guy, I don't know if you would know him. I'm trying to sign in for this. It was called Sex and God, I think it is.
Okay.
And it's by an American counselor, psychologist. But his approach to it all was that he'd been in seminary studying to be a priest. And he came out of seminary convinced that the coercive measures that the church used was the problem. And he's now an atheist. He's counseled lots of people. And he says that for most people, and you probably could have a good conversation with him about this, because I think your view would be different. But his view was that for most people, it was only after they had deconstructed and left their faith behind that they could start to enjoy a good and healthy sex. He's very out there with that. But some of the things, for example, he talks about a couple of cultures that would refuse to be evangelized, and you might know about some of this stuff. One culture in the Pacific Islands that was matriarchal, and as soon as the girl went through puberty, the mother would encourage her, and she would know all about sex by then anyway, and sex was talked about freely and blah, 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 and the mother would encourage her, go out and find a boy, right? I don't know what they did with gay people. I would expect that there's acceptance there, but it was go and find a boy and bring him home and have sex. And if she ended up getting pregnant, right, at some point, then the mother and her mother, the girl who got pregnant and her mother and the uncles would raise the child. The father,
okay.
She wouldn't even know who the father was. But so this is a
really... that's siring, right? Isn't it?
It's like that. But apparently it's a happy, well-balanced society that became Christian, but didn't take on the white Christian approach to sex, which is interesting. And there's a few cultures like that. But yeah, he
there's
argues
plenty of cultures like that too. I feel like and this is true for LGBTQ people. LGBTQ is a very like Western, white Western kind of term. Yeah. And queer people, non-binary people, trans people have always existed, but they got persecuted, they got legislated, they got murdered, and largely got wiped out, even to some way that some of the indigenous terms that are used for LGBTQ people are like now considered slurs because there's been so much. And what we're seeing now is this reemergence, and some of that's happening a little bit during the decolonialization periods as well, because half these countries that have criminalization laws are Commonwealth countries. These laws were not native to the country. They came with the British colonizers. And so you see now in the Caribbean, Belize and Nevis and St. Kitts and Antigua, and then Singapore, more recently in India too, now saying this wasn't really our law. If we really are our own country, we don't need to have this foreign imposed law. And I think that might also change the culture. And of course, colonizers came with a cross in one hand and a gun in the other hand, and did not leave people a whole lot of choice for what to do. And so watching this reemergence of the rich diversity of sexual orientation, gender identity, and even just ordering of society and an understanding of sexuality, I think will actually be really good for the world. And I do want to make the case, if we could flip the power piece, I think most religions, including Christianity, could actually have a really good, robust, faithful ministry. We let sex and sexuality be the trump card over everything else, and pay more attention to that than to a lot of other things that are even more explicitly referenced in our scripture or in our teachings. And one of the things that has always bugged me in the United States has been the understanding. People get really hung up of, I can't show this to kids because there's a gay person. I can't show it. It's inappropriate because there's a same-sex couple, or there's a gay person or something like that, or there's too much sex in it. But we're pretty awash in very violent images, and violence shows up from the cartoons that we show to our youngest children. We've been desensitized to that, and at least in the United States, you can see the results of that now as people turn to violence as their first act of how they deal with something. And I think that's one of the ways that, because we've said like sex is bad, but violence seems to be okay, if we reverse that and said violence is horrible and we should, remove it, censor it, don't include this, make it taboo to think of the idea of murdering someone else, which matches scripture, we'd be in a much different, better place.
I couldn't agree more. Make love, not war. And war takes on all kinds of different aspects. I'm really grateful for your time, Ross. I'm thinking I might ask you, I'm just looking at my time, 2 questions probably to finish, and I really would love to have you come back on other occasions if you'd like to. So 2 things, Ross. One is, do you have a story about one of the young people that you have worked with? Obviously, you're not going to name people, and you might want to change it a little bit so it's not recognizable or whatever. The part story about their journey in trying to accept themselves and how you've been able to help, how your camps or whatever have been able to help.
Yeah, one story I tell people, and this is always interesting. There's someone that I've worked with at GLAD for 10 years and has been in different orbits. And we work, it's odd because she's been in different phases. So my first job at GLAD was all religion all the time. Religion, faith, and values is my title. And I got put in touch with a couple former students of Bob Jones University. And I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they are far. People think that the idea, the kind of most recent campaign about religious liberty or religious freedom comes from abortion, but it actually comes from Bob Jones University saying that as a religious institution, they should not be forced to segregate and allow students of color, Black students, very insulated society.
That is terrible.
And I got put in touch with 2 students, one who got expelled because he committed the cardinal sin of watching an episode of Glee.
Oh, you're joking. Oh.
And it's a very controlling kind of environment. And he brought along his friend who I think had graduated, or I don't have this detail down, and was transgender. And so I gave them both kind of telling your own story. Here's the religion aspect. And I kept in touch with her, and later for GLAD was like doing some interviews. And so I sat her down for an interview and talked. And she also talked about growing up in a very insulated, controlling environment. And that was what it was like from being a child, from elementary school, primary school to secondary school, all the way through Bob Jones University. And said, it wasn't until after I graduated from Bob Jones University that I ever even heard the word transgender. And when I learned what that word meant, a light bulb went off to say, oh, that's the word that describes what I've been feeling and talking about and presumably getting counseling and having people try to fix me for so long. I didn't know that word existed because I was in an environment that refused to utter it. And realize, it's just odd to realize you learn a word and you learn a definition, and then you like instantly know that is the descriptor for me. And I've been living for 20 whatever odd years without that being known. And I always think that's really really important when I talk about LGBTQ language, because it grows and changes and evolves. We learn this stuff ourselves. Like, we have feelings and things are inside and we don't know how to put it into words. We don't know what to do about it. And then the relief of learning, oh, that exists. It means I'm not alone. It means somebody else has gone through this and experienced it. Yep. And again, she's not religious. She's pretty burned from having pretty bad experience. Yeah. But also is incredibly kind and wise and smart. And we still work together, and has really been a good advocate and a good expert and such an articulate spokesperson and representation for the community. Wow. And realizing, like, having done that again after having come through a moment where I can't talk about things, I can't say things, I can't talk about my true self. No. And I think of these university campuses, private religious schools that sometimes, again, go back to exerting control.
Yeah.
And this is connected, but several weeks ago I read The Downfall of Jerry Falwell Jr. And someone did a much longer, he interviewed him and talked to other people that were around at Liberty and realized that campus just seems like it's about control. It was Jerry Falwell Jr. or Sr. seeing how fast he could drive down the road and watch students run out of his way. It's like, how can I amass and control that power?
Yes.
And then, of course, I have to ask, why are we calling that religious? What representation of Christianity is that? And where do you see behaving this way, including what Jerry Falwell Jr. did, to being any kind of representation of the teachings that we've been handed down? I think of that sort of story and just realized like it connects a little bit for me for the interfaith piece as well. Those insulated environments are very scared to have you learn things that are not about them. And I think the more comfortable I am with myself and who I am actually makes me better to relate to people who are different, because I know I'm not them, but I can also respect and understand that they are human, what we have in common, and what makes their life and their experience different than mine. So I don't just pretend like they're another version of Ross, a tall, white, gay guy, American, right? And so that helps me to know and understand and stay in relationship with people that have some area of difference from me, because that's going to be everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, look, that's a wonderful story. I think when I think of you mentioned that person that you've worked with and the transgender link. When I think of the people in Africa that we work with, and if I can put it in these terms, it's bad enough to be gay or lesbian in those cultures where I guess if you worked really hard, you could cover it. But to be transgender is not the same. It takes a huge amount of bravery for someone to try and be themselves in a culture where they can get killed for being who they are. And so some of these mindless and hateful people who keep condemning these folk, they've probably never had to exercise an ounce of courage compared to what these folk do. And it's not a choice. It's who they are. Now, to finish with, two things. I've said two, now I've added one. The two things are, I've obviously come from a strong faith background, too strong faith because of the cult aspects. And then I've been involved in church and I led a Christian overseas aid organisation. I've now got to the stage where I still love Jesus and the parables and so on. I'm not 100% convinced that God exists, but that doesn't really worry me. I'm comfortable with where I am at. I don't want this podcast just to pounce on people. It's not just pouncing on the church. That's why I'm involving Christian folk in it. What I would love to finish with, if you happen to have one, you can bring up with one at the top of your head, one of your heroes, one of the people who inspires you because they're Christ-like.
They're Christ-like. I don't know why I struggle so much with that question.
They don't have to be religious. It's just somebody who's doing really wonderful things. If you can't think of someone, think about it later and we can do it again.
So I think one of the people, and actually I referenced her to somebody else earlier today, someone I've worked with for a really long time, her name's Nicole Garcia, and she is religious. She is a Latina transgender former police officer who became a counselor and then became a pastor, a minister.
Wow.
And led a congregation, and now is working for another LGBTIQ advocacy organization in the United States. And we have kind of similar jobs in these different organizations. She's older than me, but also went through seminary after me, so had a career before then too. And I think a couple things. Because of her police background and her role as a parole officer, very clear about boundaries, very clear about what she wants people to do, very clear about what she's asking for and pushing for, and knows that really well. And then also has this really big, compassionate heart, and then a strategic, what are we going to do about it in the wider world? And having her, when she went to get her master's in counseling, she was a parole officer, and she said, I would like to meet with people who want to meet with me, not just people that are mandated by the state to meet with me. And so you see that rolling through, and then her pastoring a congregation and seeing her do that. And I've recommended her to be a spokesperson or a leader or face. And I see her like always reinventing herself, but always carrying those past experiences, those past lives that she's been having, and integrating that all into the one person that she is today, as she is being a minister and an advocate and an upholder of justice and a counselor, and being able to hold that together. And I feel like that's it's very kind of Jesus-like in terms of Christ-like. It's It's building relationships with people. It's being clear about what you want to see from them. It's telling stories. It's educating and edifying and pointing to people toward something that is bigger than the little lives that we live here right now. And so I think she's one that I often think of and hold up and do these references for and say that she's an excellent example of Christianity. And again, has lived through some really difficult times, some big challenges.
Wow.
And carries that with her, and it informs the work that she does in a really good way.
Fantastic. Thank you. And the last thing is, I want you to give me a really feel-funny podcast. Maybe an example from it that will make people have a giggle. Yes,
Jesus. It's funny, it's enjoyable, and I try to make it as irreverent as possible. So the most recent episode that is up is a version of what we call the Baked Bible Story. The hosts get high on weed and then tell Bible stories back and forth. And this last episode was titled, What's Touched Your Lips? So there's a story from Isaiah where Isaiah gets called and says, oh, woe to me, for I am a man of unclean lips and I come from a people of unclean lips. And then an angel comes by with hot coals and touches his mouth, and then somehow that makes it better. I don't understand that part, and so we did a whole thing about what is that on your lips? Did it leave a little bit of residue? What'd you do to make your lips so unclean anyway? And leading into every sexual innuendo that we could with this particular story and leaning into that. And then I will say my other favorite, actually I need to start working on now, is we've done some Christmas specials, and one year we did a pageant, except we're a little podcast. We don't play any music that anyone could ever claim as copyrighted. And so we basically don't do anything with music whatsoever.
Yep.
And so we can't sing Christmas carols. So instead I wrote some Christmas carols just to help advance this story. And my favorite one that I wrote was a song that is a conversation between Joseph and Mary. And they are preparing to travel to Bethlehem for the census that was being taken. And Mary says, how am I supposed to travel when I am pregnant? And then Joseph sings a song that I titled Ride My Ass. And it involves the line, my ass is hairy, my ass is brown, you can ride my ass into Bethlehem town. And I'm probably the most proud of coming up with that rhyme and that song that I really should do my own copyright on, because I'm sure that's going to become one that you're going to hear every December from now on.
I reckon, absolutely. So when does that come out, that one?
So that is from 2 Christmases ago.
Oh, it's out already.
Yeah, that one's out in the world. And then we are doing, actually this week, we're doing one with guests based on a documentary film that's happening called Mama Bears. That's about evangelical Christian moms that love their queer kids and they're very fierce about it. This one's a little more serious, but we've been doing a series of queer Christian saints. And it's been the like Tammy Faye Baker, Dolly Parton, Betty White, and then Lonnie Frisbee, the Jesus Movement.
Yep.
And I just wrote one about Carl Bean, who was the founder and archbishop of the Unity Fellowship Church. He was a Motown singer and a disco singer before he founded the church. And one of the songs that he sang was a song titled I Was Born This Way. And it's this disco song. It's like, I'm happy, I'm gay, thanks, I was born this way. That was the inspiration for Lady Gaga's Born This Way. And that was a big hit from the 70s. That then, and listen to them side by side and see what you hear in terms of the strands, but like realizing you have this like old gay disco anthem, you have this relatively new, now 10-year-old gay anthem that kind of everyone knows. And then in between, he founded a church and did an AIDS ministry that was focused specifically on Black and Latine people as well. And so took the rejection that he felt at church and funneled it into arts and music and, got known something. So I think that really cool like marriage between the ministry and also the I'm happy, I'm gay, I was born this way. And then the Lady Gaga aspect too means all the queers are going to love it.
Look, that's fantastic. Now, we're finishing. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, Ross. And you're a terrific guy and you interview well as well. So listen.
Thank you. The podcast is basically wherever you can get podcasts, and that's been
cool.
So yeah, if you look up Yes Jesus, YASJESUS. I realize yes does not have a common spelling.
Okay,
that's important to note.
I will start now listening to that for sure. And have you got a good?
It's been pretty good. We took a couple months off in July and August, so we're just coming back right now. But we've had a pretty good following. We're doing some of our own kind of building. And I think one of the exciting things is this documentary interview that we're doing will be cool because we're Dan, he's an actor. If you watch Mean Girls, he was in, that's what he's best known for. And he got invited to be a juror at the International LGBTQ Film Festival. And so we're going to record from the Holy Land. And so we're trying to build out like what that's going to look like. And they can record a couple podcasts live, like in the event space, but then they also are just super excited to. He's also very big into something called the Naked Archaeologist that does a lot of let's visit the places that you hear about in the Bible and talk about where they are and what they, and I've done a little bit of that in Greece, but I haven't been to the Holy Land yet. I'm excited for that. And we'll build couple episodes out of that after it happens.
Oh, that's great. I found Asses of the Bible. Is that the one?
No, that's a whole episode about asses. Let me go back. It's going to be a couple Christmases ago, and I could put it in the chat here with us too.
That'd be great. I love that. All-time Leviticus ridiculous.
Oh, that was one of our... people love that one. I write all these, so... the episode is the queerest Christmas pageant ever. That's what the name of the episode is.
So if you've enjoyed this interview today and you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us. You can support us through Patreon. You can support us through the links to direct payments. And you can do it from as little as $5 or $10. You can make it a regular payment if you like, because we are trying to help queer refugees and people who cannot survive without your help and without mine.